Well, welcome everyone, and thanks so much to our panelists for taking time to talk with us. I'll be very brief just to kind of set things up a little bit. The focus tonight's going to be on civil liberties around media and the press in the current political moment. And in the U.S., civil liberties refers most centrally to various rights and liberties that are protected in the U.S. Constitution, especially in the Bill of Rights, but it's by no means only a legal topic. I've been teaching a course called Freedom of Speech in the 27 years, as I was just reminded that I've been teaching here. Almost every year I've taught it, and it's just amazing. Every year there's some fresh, really hot, important new free speech topic in the newspaper that I couldn't have anticipated. It's really always in the news. And every time I teach it, I also realize the students come to the realization, one of the first things they learn is that there's a lot more to freedom of speech than the First Amendment. And you're going to see some of this. Okay, great, thanks. Maybe we'll have more time to talk about these issues in the Q&A. So why don't we now hear from Scott MacKay and Chris Chivers, starting with Scott.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming here. Thank the ACLU. I think our biggest problem is that too many people in government think that the Bill of Rights only begins with the Second Amendment. Farther away. Probably not. The other thing, I want to thank someone for mentioning the great Bill McLaughlin, the late great Bill McLaughlin, who was just a fabulous professor at Brown, a religion, nationally known, and had this unique love for Rhode Island, and has basically written the best history and most comprehensive history of Rhode Island. I know because I've been using it lately. We're doing our next big project as a 1 square mile thing looking at the city of Pawtucket, and sure enough, the first thing I go to for reference, Bill McLaughlin, so thank you for that. You know, let's talk about the backdrop of what we're talking about tonight, and this comes from ProPublica through my good friend Ed Fitzpatrick, who's here tonight. Now, we're talking all about the First Amendment, but perhaps the biggest problem on top of all of this is, let's run the clock back 20 years. In 1998, 400,000 jobs were in newspapers. 400,000. Today, that's down to 140,000. Let me tell you, it's dropping fast. So the idea that there's a strong free press out there is simply not what it used to be. Now, if we look hard at the template, what governs our First Amendment laws? It's a 1964 case, as far as dealing with politicians, called the New York Times versus Sullivan. Now, this is the template for everything the media can do in the realm of politics. And at the time it was decided, the roots of it actually go back to early in the 20th century. There's a guy named Zechariah Chafee, yes? Yeah. From that same Chafee family. He was a Harvard law professor, and back in the 1920s, he was someone who was pushing for the kind of robust First Amendment that Justice Brennan wrote in the New York Times versus Sullivan case, which was decided 9-0. That wouldn't happen today, because already Justice Clarence Thomas has said we should look at this and perhaps overturn it. But what the First Amendment did in this case, it was kind of a strange case. It wasn't a news story. It was an advertisement. It was an advertisement bought in the New York Times by supporters of Martin Luther King. And what they were talking about was how the Birmingham Police Department had abused protesters for no good reason, beating them. You know, we all saw those pictures, older people, the fire hoses, Bull Connor, we all grew up with that. So those of us of a certain age, excuse me. And so what you had was this fellow, Mr. Sullivan, was the police commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama. He decided that, his reputation was ruined, even though only 35 copies of the New York Times had been sent to Montgomery County, Alabama. But of course, he got a local jury, all-white jury, to give him $500,000 judgment against the Times. The Times took the case to the Supreme Court, and they won it. And that was the template, that was the decision that put in the actual malice standard. The standard for the press, where basically you have to know something is wrong and publish it anyway for a public official to have a chance to win a libel suit. As Justice Brennan said, this was necessary because that's how the First Amendment works. Part of our profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open, was what Brennan said in that case. In reality, what this means is there's a legal roadblock for powerful people, government people, seeking to silence critics and punish the press. You can't do it through the courts with these frivolous libel suits. And that's a very, it's not the end and be all, as I'm sure Chris will touch on, with secrecy, but it is an important border. It's a clear line. And for years, you know, this was the kind of thing that was upheld, and the Times won every other case that ever came down to this. I will put in a pitch for a friend of Chris's in a great book that's just out. It's called Truth in Our Times by David McCraw. He's the Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times. And I would say this book and one by Tony Lewis, the late Anthony Lewis, his History of the First Amendment would probably be a good place to start if you're really interested in a deep dive into this issue. So we have this, and I also think we have to look at this, and all the speakers have been very good, Karen and Francesca, on what else has been going on here. Because there's always social and political ramifications. It's not just a court case, as Francesca was pointing out. It's even more than that. I mean, let's just take a couple of quick ones. The idea of facts. You know, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, of course, famously said, you can have opinions, but we can't disagree on facts. Well, now we've got an administration sending Kellyanne Conway out to talk about alternative facts. Oh, okay. And what I did for, and Karen and Chris did for the early part of our careers, is what I call Gutenberg refined, okay? That's this. The old Dead Tree newspaper. Now, the Dead Tree newspaper, when you picked that up, you knew instinctively what was news, what was opinion. There's the opinion page, opinion. It's labeled opinion. Hello. And you knew what a news analysis was because it was labeled that way. Well, now that we don't have this anymore, people go to the internet where we've changed the entire structure just overnight in 15 or 20 years, where people can create a website that looks just like the New York Times website, and there is really no barrier to who wrote that story, whether it's someone like my Pulitzer Prize-winning friend, or frankly, whether it was, you know, the neighbor down the street who just flunked out of CCRI, and he's blogging in his underwear in his mother's basement. And that kid can probably create a really nice designed website. And it's really difficult in this world. You know, we used to think of people who were whistleblowers telling us the truth. You know, you've all seen the movie The Post. So, to our generation, this was like Daniel Ellsberg, okay? You know, here he is at his copy machine late at night when nobody's around, you know, telling the truth, leaking this story to the New York Times and the Post and the Boston Globe. And now, that's all changed. We now have a situation where, with social media, you know, Russian agendas reached 126 million Facebook users just in the last election cycle. So we're in a whole new uncharted waters here. And this is really something that I think the whole country is going to have to face. The other thing that drives me crazy, and the more you shut down the news, is I was thinking the other day, going back, and I took a look at it, you know, Hannah Arendt, excuse me, when you talk about her wonderful origins of totalitarianism, one of the things she says is, that leads to totalitarianism is no when it no longer matters to the populace whether something is true or not. And that, I think, is a huge problem. What we're going to be forced to do in this new world order is Americans are going to have to become better consumers of news, smarter, better educated, and really the only way you're going to do that is to have smart news consumers. Now, this isn't going to be easy either, and part of this is the education system. You know, I did a column recently on what I call historical and civic illiteracy, and boy, is it rampant in this country. A 2016 Annenberg Public Policy Center shows just 26% could identify the three branches of government. Only 37% could name any of the rights granted by the First Amendment. And you know, even at Ivy League Brown right here, Luther Spear, who's been a senior lecturer here for many, many years, teaches the history of American education, great guy, by the way, says that even at Brown, he's astounded at how many students lack some basic understanding of how the government actually works. You know, the other one was a Woodrow Wilson Foundation poll that found out only a third of Americans would pass the citizenship test currently given to immigrants. Hello. Less than a quarter knew the colonists rebelled against the British. More than half didn't know how many justices sit on the Supreme Court, and 60% did not know which countries fought against the United States in World War II. I mean, that's a pretty dismal thing, and I don't blame the education system because nowadays they're making teachers teach to tests. And so if you only test, you know, math and science and how to write a sentence or something, and you don't test civics or history, you can't blame the teachers who are going to be evaluated on the kids' scores if they don't teach it. And I think Massachusetts has just very smartly passed legislation requiring that there be civics training in all of the high schools in the state and even in middle schools. And I think that's really, really needed. The other thing is this entire new world order that we're in with this flood of lawsuits and trying to challenge falsehoods. And I think that given both the weakening of the traditional U.S. press and this whole new animal, the internet, that nobody really knows social media, how to regulate it. I mean, our free society for years has said, again, the New York Times Sullivan decision, and anybody who teaches the First Amendment will know this, that basically we want an open society, we want open discussion, a free press, and the rest of it, Americans can figure it out. If they can educate themselves well enough, they'll be able to figure it out. The problem is now, and I think Chris is going to probably touch on this better and deeper than I can, but your government has 800,000 employees who have top secret classifications. I mean, this is not about protecting needed government secrets. Nobody in the press ever wants to leak something or print something that's going to get Danny Pearl killed. You just don't ever do that. But what's happened now is politics, the idea that we can do this in secret and not tell you what's going on has become de rigueur. You know, you file for a FOIA, it's half redacted. And you know, and you paid for this. It's the government that's doing this to themselves. And I just think that, you know, over the years, the idea was, no, we don't need more lawsuits. We don't need to figure this out. What we need is more speech. And more speech from everyone will lead to a better society or a small d democracy. If people don't have the information that they need to go forward, we are really in serious trouble, bigger trouble than we ever think. And I don't know where this is going to lead because nobody is smart enough to know, and I've talked to some of the smart people in the business, nobody is smart enough to know. I'm not, none of us on this panel are smart enough to know where the news business is heading next, because it's really in flux with the social media world, with the continued diminishing of the resources in the world of the media. I'm particularly worried not about Chris or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or even perhaps the LA Times or the Boston Globe, which has a very good owner who's investing in it. What concerns me are places like Providence and Des Moines and Ithaca, New York and Burlington, Vermont and Manchester, New Hampshire and Exeter, Rhode Island, where nobody is watching the government anymore from the press. You know, you just don't have those people. I think our local paper, Alan Rosenberg, I think is doing as good a job as he can as the editor of the Journal, but you know what? He's only got 13 news reporters. What's he supposed to do? He's getting a lot of people, good stuff, but you can't cover the state or paper that used to have more than 100 reporters. You can't do that with a dozen. You just can't, no matter how good they are. If I had 12 Chris Chivers, I couldn't cover the whole state of Rhode Island. So I just want to throw out some things to think of, and those are the things that keep me awake at night. So thank you for listening.
Follow Scotty. Great. I'm pleased to be on a panel that is so negative and blunt. Though I am unflinchingly and unapologetically and almost thoroughly negative about the state of things. I'm going to stay in a narrower lane, but I'm going to be just as dark because I should be. Just a little bit of background about the origins of what I'm going to say. That since 2001, in my job covering war, particularly American organized wars, I have quite literally watched the punishment and candor, the punishment of candor and public honesty as a matter of both practice and policy. I want to talk about the criminalization of truth, which I've watched sort of envelop our national security establishment during my professional life. I want to say something because we've talked a lot about Trump. This isn't about Trump. It's also, he doesn't get a pass. But we've watched this with 3 presidents and both parties having control of the legislature and the White House. This is a systemic problem, so I'd like to depersonalize it from the current national leader. And when I say practice and policy, I'm not just talking about the games of keep away that we heard about, where officials routinely deny even the existence of records and deny your FOIAs and make you go to court and pay exorbitant copying fees. You know, sometimes you can ask for records in a public archive and be told you can have the records, but it'll be $800 to Xerox them, even though you could sit there with your phone and Genius scan and do it yourself in an hour for free. And I'm going to depersonalize it at the end. In 2001 in Libya, a NATO aircraft almost killed me with a bomb that hit a position, a rebel position where I was standing. It was a 500-pound laser-guided bomb. This was a mistake. War is a thicket of mistakes. I accept it as a mistake. The pilot erred in his judgment. Lines had moved. I was standing someplace that the day before was held by a different force. And the pilot wasn't up to date. But I survived to ask about what happened. And the militaries, the American and multiple NATO militaries and the NATO command initially lied, flat out lied about what had happened. First they said it was a Gaddafi position. Then they gave the names of things they hit, which they didn't hit. I know what they hit, I was there. As this was proved false, then they went to the next level of denial, and they spent months delaying and refusing any request for information. They would not even release the nation that commanded the Air Force that dropped the bomb. Why? Do you think that is protecting the public? Or do you think that is preventing embarrassment and accountability? That's what secrecy is mostly doing. You won't find us, the people at the table, who want to publish secrets that could imperil lives or endanger programs. We don't see that as our role. But most of the time when we're running up against secrecy, on the other end is someone who thinks it's their duty to prevent agency or official embarrassment and accountability. I'd like to say that, remember, this was a personal anecdote, but I want to depersonalize it. Professionally, I found it extraordinarily useful. When they're lying to you about shit you see firsthand, when they tell you a nickel is a dime, and that an orange is an apple, and that green is yellow, it's very, very helpful in developing your bullshit filters and in how you face off with the people on the other side of the conversation. So in many ways, I find what happened in that instance valuable. So how do we, the organizing question today was, in this climate, how do we defend truth, right? That's what we're supposed to be getting at, so I'll end there and I'll get out of your way. We defend truth, real truth, not someone's version, by calmly and unceasingly reminding governments that they are there to serve us, not the other way around. And that the practice of civil discourse, which is the foundation of civil society, demands transparency. This means being like me. You can look at me, I'm kind of an asshole. It means asking questions, filing lawsuits, using shame as a tool for the abusers of our rights, against the abusers of our rights. In short, it believes in the agency of the citizenry. That's you, that's me. We're all in it together. You know, when I was in the Marine Corps, my battalion had a motto. Everyone's got a motto. Ours was whatever it takes. Wasn't much of a motto. But one of the Marines got a t-shirt that describes the way a lot of the people in this country are willing to accept things. You know, his t-shirt was the same battalion logo, and what an old motto was, he wrote in, whatever they tell us. That's the system we're living in now, and we fight it by fighting it.
Thanks so much. I wonder if you have either a question or comment with respect to the others, or...
I'm gonna ask Scotty. He's a better talker than me, so I'm gonna give you the mic by asking a question. So Scotty, and this goes to you guys too, because you talked about, you know, the Providence Journal reporter versus the kid in his underwear in his basement. Both putting online things that visually look like news, but only one of them is. I wonder how you feel about, and I'm just throwing this out there, it's a thought exercise, not an actual proposal, a shared code of standards for opinion versus news. A shared code of standards, so like you held up this paper and you said, you know, the front end is news and the back end is opinion, and in between is news analysis, so labeled. Is there a shared code of standards we could develop for the internet?
It's really difficult. People have grappled with this for years. If you go back to the Hutchins report, the University of Chicago president who tried, you know, many years ago, Walter Lippmann, all these folks, it's very, very hard to get. However, we're at a real strange time right now where the American marketplace of ideas and this Constitution, this First Amendment that was written in a horse and buggy era that just never really saw, like I say, we all did Gutenberg refined. And for about 250 years, that's what happened. In the last 20 years, it's gone off the rails. And the government, on some things with regard to Facebook, I think there are people, both on the open internet thing, and I think some people are looking at these big tech people like Google, and those folks, to regulate them more like we used to regulate, say, a common carrier or an electric utility, the gas company, that kind of thing. I worry a lot if we try to upend the marketplace, because the problem is, the beauty of our system is that no one person or interest group or governmental entity has been able to define what is news, who's a reporter, who isn't. It's not like you gotta pass a bar exam. It's not like the government can come and shut down your newspaper. It's true, what you say about the secrecy aspect is probably the worst thing that goes on. I mean, Hillary Clinton's server thing, you know, I mean, the other problem is everything's polarized nowadays. I don't care if it's football, the news, you know, it's not Walter Cronkite. People used to read the New York Times. My father was a Republican, and he used to read the New York Times every day, and he'd grouse and say, damn liberals. And then he would tell me, you should read that paper every day. I said, what do you mean, Dad? You're always complaining about liberals. He was a Republican. He said, because it's the best damn newspaper in the world, and it covers the news.
Short Scotty MacKay. The answer is no.
Lucky I have editors.
We're friends.
We are. Many years.
Scott, did you have something you might want to ask Chris about his remarks at all before we, and just a moment, the students who are going to set up the mics could do that now. I don't know if somebody's going to, great, thanks so much. We'll open it to Q&A.
Yeah, administration after administration, you know what happened was you got the sense from the Pentagon Papers that the government basically, for quite a few years, had just flat out lied to the American people about everything about Vietnam. And I just wonder, in your career, or have you seen lately, you know, times when you've had a tough story that you go to the Pentagon with it, and just how does that work these days? Is there the same honor among thieves that there once was? Or do they just shut you guys down and it becomes a total adversarial process?
So I can give you two examples on fairly prominent work. A few years ago, I was involved in a story that said that there were old, remnant, junk chemical weapons in Iraq that had been used by the militants and the bomb makers in their bomb-making campaign. They weren't what you think of as chemical weapons. They could have been fired as designed to cross distance to distribute chemical weapons. They were the kind of the junk or the refuse of the old program. And they had hurt Americans, and some Iraqis as well, but we knew a fairly large quantity of Americans who had been burned by mustard agent projectiles that were used unwittingly, we think, by the insurgents in roadside bombs. Insurgents thought they were simple artillery shells, but they had mustard in them. I knew about it about 2 years before we published the story. And because it was all classified, the way to get around the classification was to find the victims and get their medical records. There's the medical records. They had to be treated for their burns, their chemical burns, and the medical records wouldn't be stamped secret. And it took a long time to find these gentlemen. They're scattered around the country. I burned an incredible amount of salary and expenses on this. But we found a bunch of them. And finally I got one who never has been on record to this day, but he went over his case with me, and he said that I could use his name in a meeting with the Pentagon if they pushed back and denied it. Couldn't publish it. He wanted to protect his medical privacy. He said, you know, I live in this small town in the following state. It's a very rural state. He said, I don't want to be the guy in my town. I got bit by mustard. I just want to be a guy in my town. And we respected that because of medical privacy. So I went and had a meeting with a very bold-faced name, 4-star general in the military. And I told him why I was coming. I said, I want to talk about these remnant chemical weapons that were found and the people who were wounded by them. And I was treated to this really weird lunch with the general and a brigadier general and a colonel in the room. And the general had like a little manila folder, and he opened the folder, and there was like a piece of paper with almost no information on it. I told them why I was coming. I wanted them to have preparatory time. I didn't want to waste their time by ambushing them. And he took the paper out and basically said, the answer is no. We've gone around and we've queried everyone here, and we can't find any evidence that what you're saying is true. And I know reporters like scandals, but hey, Chris, you just don't have one here. I'm sorry. And to which I basically said, well, sir, thank you for that presentation. You should know whoever wrote that little piece of paper you just read to me is either lying or lazy or both. And I got a name for you and a date. And I said the guy's name and I said the date and I told him where on the road it happened in Iraq. I shared the location, a particular intersection. And I said, tell your boys to go look that up. Then I get back to me. Nobody talks to them like this. And he literally kind of shuddered. I almost heard the click in his head, and he turned to one of the other officers and said, within the bounds of the law, find out what the fuck is going on here. And for 2 years, I never heard from him again. I went about my work. I found about 20 of these people, built the whole story. I got about 16 of them on the record. I got their medical records. I got their photographs of many of the incidents, photographs of some of the ordnance. I found some Iraqi victims. We went into Iraq, we traveled Iraq, we went to the sites. It took like forever. And I faced a lot of denial. I mean, it's after the cause of the war being chemical weapons and no chemical weapons being found, to come around and say, actually, there were a few. You had to convince a lot of editors you had your facts right before they're going to initial off on this. It took a lot of time, internally and externally. The whole time, the military was continuing to deny it officially. The whole time. About a week before we knew we were going to publish, this answers your question, I went down to Washington with one of our senior reporters. We asked for a meeting with the White House. We were denied it. We were told to go talk to Chuck Hagel's senior spokespeople. And I went in with a big binder. And I said, I've got all my facts here, and I'm open, if any of these facts you can establish that I have them wrong, then I'm not going to publish that fact. Here's every incident I know of, here's every name, here's every date, here's every consequence. I'm publishing this soon. I would like a thorough and responsible statement. And it took them about a week, but they gave like a paragraph, and we put it in the story, so that was an example. And I have to say that in respect to them, they did not take the information we shared with them. I don't go into the Pentagon much, and people on the beat know who I am, and so a lot of other reporters saw me in the building meeting senior people. They're like, you know, what's going on with Chris? And it would have been very easy for them to undercut my story by leaking it to a competitor, but they didn't. They were stand up about it, and they reacted to the story. Once it was published, they swung around 180 and acknowledged it, and actually started to give some of these veterans care. Another example, in Libya, they said they had 0 civilian casualties from the airstrikes. It was a lie. I went around the country and collected the ordnance remnants and the death certificates and established who they had killed by accident. And I made a similar thing, a 27-page thorough memo with Xeroxes of the gift certificates with pictures of the ordnance, blood on the walls. In some cases, I had witnessed some of the strikes. And again, it took months. And I provided that to NATO for comment, because it was NATO that was going around lying about the cleanliness of their air campaign, and they leaked chunks of my memo.